All right. Hey, everyone, welcome. We are so glad to have you tonight. We're going to go ahead and get started. So good evening and welcome to History Happy Hour, Asian Activism, 1960s to today. My name is Beth Whitaker and I am the Education Manager at the Indiana Historical Society. It's great to see so many of you here tonight with us. This happy hour is brought to you with support from One America Financial Partners, a national provider in insurance and financial services marketplace. Now, at the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. We do this by collecting millions and millions of paper-based documents, materials such as books, paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, maps, and other interesting finds. And then we use all of those in interesting, exciting, and intriguing ways, sharing them, whether that be through publications, exhibits, or events like this. So it is these pieces, that tell the diverse, unconventional, and even sometimes a bit saucy stories of Indiana. And we're excited to bring you one of these stories today. Now, before I introduce Nicole, our moderator, a few pieces of logistics. For this event, Dr. Suzuki and Nicole will chat for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So if you have a question at the end or as we're going along, you can go ahead and drop them into the question and answer section, and we'll keep an eye on them throughout. We'll try to pepper some of them in as we get to that second half of the program. You are all muted tonight, but we definitely still want to hear those thoughts and comments, so be sure that you're typing those in for us. When you type them in, make sure that you're sending it to all panelists, or if you're replying, all panelists and all attendees, so that everyone can see your reply. Also, keep an eye out for links and URLs. Those are going to be in that same Q&A chat section. And with those, if you miss one, don't worry, because all of the links are going to be delivered to your inbox in a follow-up email tomorrow morning. This program is being recorded, so you will be able to watch the replay on our website, indianahistory.org, in the upcoming weeks. And if you enjoy this program, we hope that you'll come back for some more. So join us for our next happy hour. Next week is going to be about the Equal Rights Amendment on August 6th. And there's several more things coming up, so be sure that you check out indianahistory.org for more information on this and our other virtual offerings that we have coming to an internet near you. Now, without further ado, let me introduce to you Nicole Martinez-Legrand. She is the coordinator of multicultural collections at the Indiana Historical Society, and she will be getting us started.
I am muted. I'm unmuted. All right. My name is Nicole Martinez-Legrand. Yes, I am the Multicultural Collections Coordinator. I started here at the Indiana Historical Society in 2016, charged with the very large task of building our collection with our Latino and our Asian community throughout the state of Indiana. And so David and I met actually on Halloween in 2018 when he and I sat down to record his oral history, basically his life story. And so that and many other oral histories are on file here or in our archives at the Indiana Historical Society. So David, I'm gonna let you introduce yourself because I can talk about you as the day is long, but only you can do it best. So David, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, didn't quite expect that.
Sorry.
But
it's just like when we had our conversation.
I'm David Suzuki, and although many people in the community would be aware of some of the community-related activities that I've participated in Indianapolis and in Indiana, my career, so to speak, was as a neuroscientist. And as a neuroscientist, I came to Indiana to join the faculty in the IU School of Medicine. But I came from California, raised in Oakland, California, which is why there's a background of Huey P. Newton in back of me.
So before we jump into who Huey P. Newton was in Oakland, California, and why that's significant, you were born in December of 1945, and you were born at Tule Lake Segregation Center to Joan and Harry Suzuki. So can you tell us a little bit about why your parents were at Tule Lake and what Tule Lake Segregation Center is?
Right. Well, right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the following year, that was in December. So the following year, politicians moved very quickly toward a policy that imprisoned Japanese citizens and Japanese in these isolated camps away from the general populace. So first, Japanese Americans were put in assembly centers, which were mainly racetracks or fairgrounds, like state fairgrounds. But in essence, people were put into what were formerly animal stalls. And after that, after being assembled, quote, assembled, in these really dismal quarters, the people were shipped off to the internment centers, which the vocabulary, if I were teaching this, I would describe them as concentration camps. And I know that for some people that the use of that word might be controversial, and because stereotypically concentration camps are associated with the extermination centers under the Nazi regime in Europe during World War II. But if you do go to the dictionary and look up concentration camps, you'll see that what happened to the Japanese Americans can be described as imprisonment in concentration camps. And in fact, politicians, including the president at that time, President Roosevelt, used that term concentration camps. So there were, after the assembly center, people were sent to these concentration camps, of which there were 10, and they were always in very desolate areas, as you can see by this picture of Tule Lake. And during this imprisonment time, there came a move to test the loyalty, move on the part of the government to test the loyalty, quote unquote, loyalty of Japanese Americans. And there were two questions in there that many people in the Japanese American community took issue with. And one related to a question concerning a person's willingness to fight for the United States on all the fronts that the United States was involved in during World War II. And that was problematic because there were many Japanese Americans who had relatives in Japan. So there was one fear of them having to be battling a cousin or an uncle in the Pacific theater. So that was a concern.
And also,
not to mention the fact, pardon?
I said it was also, rendering them nationless.
Right. Well, that was the second question. The second question had to do with would people be willing to relinquish their loyalty to the Emperor of Japan or forswear, I think the vocabulary was forswear their loyalty to the Emperor of Japan and swear allegiance to the United States. Well, that was problematic because the first generation that were from Japan, meaning my grandparents' generation, they felt no loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. Plus the fact that at that time, from 1923 on, or 1924 on, Asians in the United States could not seek citizenship. So they were banned from becoming citizens. So if they answered yes to that second question, then it was viewed as putting them in a legal limbo, meaning they would if they forswore allegiance to the emperor, they were no longer Japanese citizens, and the U.S. Denied citizenship to my grandfather's generation. So for those reasons, plus the reason of if some of them felt that if they did fight for the United States, that was not tolerable given that their parents were in these concentration camps. So for these complex reasons, many, I think about 20,000 said no to those questions. And then eventually the government labeled them as disloyal and segregated them into this special concentration camp, the segregation center, which was Tule Lake. And that's where I was born.
Go ahead and share that that photo of you 1 month old in Tule Lake. And so your parents did actually, so I did research on your family, and I found records that they were at Gila River, and then both were interred or were sent to Tule Lake Segregation Center, and that's where they met, and that's where they also got married. Correct?
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
I always found that interesting as, kind of family lore, that they were actually in the same concentration camp, Gila River, but they somehow didn't cross paths, or maybe they did, but they didn't spot each other. But it was at Tule Lake that they did indeed cross paths and dated, and to the degree that one could date in a concentration camp, and eventually got married.
So here is their wedding photo in 1945. And then here are your parents again, and then here are you. You're swaddled up. So right. This photo is from January 10th, 1946. And then research that I found your records of your family's records, and so you were all discharged on March 6th, 1946. So tell us a little bit about your journey from Tule Lake to Oakland. Well, I'm sure you don't remember most of it because you were a toddler, but what was your parents' experience like once they were discharged?
Well, maybe if I could start before they were discharged. Why?
Sure.
Because the war had ended and many people had already left Tule Lake. And the reason that my parents stayed there was because they feared the unknown, meaning they had heard stories about racism on the outside and bad things happening to Japanese Americans. So they decided to stay at Tule Lake until I was born, because it was a known environment. The hospital there was a known entity to my parents. So even though many people had already left, they stayed there until I was born. And then they left, as you said, in March of 1946. And their first residence was in Richmond, California, in federal housing. And unfortunately, I don't know how many Japanese Americans lived there. I can assume that there were probably a significant number, but my father would talk about getting day jobs. Much as you see some people, some men, predominantly men in the Latinx community waiting for these day jobs outside of, say, Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever they're looking for jobs. And my father would do that. He would look for these day jobs right after the war. And then after that, I'm not sure how they made this relationship, but they went to work for this rich family in a place called Piedmont, California, which I've always thought an odd city. Piedmont is a city, but it's totally surrounded by the city of Oakland. So it's a city within a city, and that city of Piedmont is for the very rich. So my mother was the live-in maid and cook, and my father was the live-in gardener, and I was the live-in baby.
So as the live-in baby, what I didn't know in that photo of you that was written on the back, so it had, you know, Harry, which is your father, Joan is your mother, and Akira. So who is Akira?
So Akira is my given name, and the story from my father was when I was born, he went to a calligraphy expert in the camp and talked about different names. And so the way it's written in Japanese, and it's an older form of Japanese writing that was used to write my name, the meaning not only means something like bright and wise, perhaps, but it also bode well. There was a lucky component to the way it was written. So that was the name that I was given, Akira. And it was when my parents were living with that rich family that the decision was made at the suggestion of that family, that rich family, or the bosses of my parents, to give me the name David. And unfortunately, how that actually, the details of how that came about, I'm not really aware of or knowledgeable about. If I were to talk to my parents now, I would really ask more details about where that name came from, why they agreed to accept that name. The why I can kind of understand. And it's like many immigrants in the United States now find that their names are always mispronounced at schools, and then they decide, some, not all, but some decide that they're going to take on a name that's easier for, you know, the dominant culture to pronounce. And hence my mother, my mother's name, the name she used was Joan, but her given name was Tamaya. And I did ask her why she chose Joan. And she said because she read in high school, she read about Joan of Arc and thought, oh, that's a strong woman, so I'm going to call myself Joan. Why my dad chose Harry, I don't know. And I don't know, again, how David came to be, but now I'm David Akira Suzuki.
So let's talk about Oakland. So you moved to Oakland when you were of school age. So tell me what it was like. You know, what were the demographics of your neighborhood? Who were your inspirations? Who were your role models? Or did you have any role models while you were in Oakland?
Right. Well, I think the background behind me that I have of Huey P. Newton indicates, and I chose that as representative of Oakland, which, having grown up there, had a big impact on me that continues to this day and kind of informs how I think about the world and how I interact with the world. But the neighborhood I grew up in was majority Black. And that, I think, meant that from K through 12, I always had friends and classmates who were African American. And at the time, you know, I never really thought about this fact, other than I was very aware that I'm different. As you look in this picture, I'm the only Asian in the picture.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, as I grew older, and I think it's around 7 or 8 that one can join the Cub Scouts, and there was an African American male who was the father of one of the boys in that picture, actually, and he decided to start a Cub Scout pack, and so I joined that pack. And when we became of age to become a Boy Scout, he started a Boy Scout troop. So throughout this long period, I was active in the Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts, and this African American male, who was the Cub Master and then eventually the Scout Master, was kind of the role model for all of us. And I think I always view myself as very lucky to have had that experience. Yesterday, I gave a talk on implicit biases, and I talked about one way of getting countering implicit biases is to have contact with people who look different or have different characteristics in oneself. So from an early age, I feel fortunate that I had this contact with an example setting African-American male. And so Oakland to me is very important.
So your parents, your father owned, became a business owner, and so here are you with your brother in front of the dry cleaners, and so and you guys lived on the second floor, and so so you and Huey P. Newton are not necessarily super close in age, but you grew up in the same neighborhood. So, what did your parents think of Huey, and what did other people think of Huey? And just to clarify, Huey P. Newton is the founder or co-founder of the Black Panther Party.
Right. Well, Huey was older than I, so we never crossed paths in school. So we might have been there at the same time during elementary school, but I wasn't aware of him. And in junior high school, he left before I came in, and in high school, he left before I came in. But the family was in the neighborhood, so my parents knew the Newton family, and I never discussed politics with them, so I really don't know how they felt about the Black Panthers, other than I think they just felt that they didn't associate probably too much with the Black Panthers and the Newton family. The Newton family were just these longtime customers of the cleaning shop, and so my parents knew them. And I know that my mother once commented that, Huey is out of jail now. And she saw that he came into the cleaning shop and said, "Oh, hi, it's great that you're out of jail." And she related that to me, and I was kind of surprised. They knew about their relationship to the Newton family via the cleaning business, but I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
Until much
later.
Just
in the neighborhood guy, right?
Right. And for me, of course, knowledge about Huey P. Newton was more through his activities in founding the Black Panther and what the Black Panthers were doing in Oakland, California, which were all very positive. And I think the media for a long time has portrayed the Black Panthers as maybe terrorists, but actually they were servants of the community. And that's why I like the background that's behind me right now, because it says serve the people, and that's what they did. The Black Panthers served the people in Oakland and provided free breakfasts and lunches and helped the kids in the neighborhood and helped other people in the neighborhood. But they were very much community oriented. And they set an example for me.
It's good. I'm glad you mentioned that. So, given that they were, an active example of what activism is, how would you define, you went to college, you went to UC Berkeley in the 60s, which was kind of like the epicenter where a lot of things were happening culturally on a wide variety of levels, as the 60s does represent. But before, I guess, at that age, college age, how would you have defined activism as you were seeing it play out in real life?
Well, I think as a college student, it was any sense of activism was evolving. And on the one hand, I was aware of what the Black Panthers were doing and the good that they were doing in the community. And as a college student for 2 summers, there was a project an educational project in a migrant labor camp up in Northern California. And for 2 summers, I spent with other students from Berkeley, helping run the school for the children of migrant laborers. And I think that really made an impact on me in terms of at least the issues in the community, because I would see these families in essence, a one-room metal shack with a bulb hanging down from the ceiling. And that was their lodging. And they had no running water. They had to go to a communal area to get water for everything that they did, for bathing, etc. And the lavatories were there. And it just struck me as a very oppressive environment. And that, I think, the fact that I was actually doing something supposedly to help them, I'm not sure how much we actually helped them, but I know that they helped me learn about oppression. And that probably got me thinking about, well, what can I do to improve the lives of people? And that's kind of the birth, with a personal birth of participating in activities that bring about change for the better.
Did your parents ever talk about their experiences being at Tule Lake Segregation Center, or what that was like in terms of, giving you maybe a clear sense of what oppression is like?
No, and I think that is a common answer, that people, Japanese Americans of my generation, meaning the third generation, didn't hear much about the prison experience from our parents. And it's because the prison experience was a traumatic experience for my parents and their parents. So my grandparents and my parents' generation, being in prison was a traumatic experience. And that kind of psychic trauma often results in a suppression of thinking about it, and let alone talking about it. And it wasn't until there were these national hearings in different cities to gain an understanding of what this experience was. And the hearings were held in relationship to gaining reparations for the financial loss. But of course, there could be no reparations for the emotional impact. And so that was the first time that Nisei, meaning my parents' generation, started talking about it. But around the dinner table, the only thing that I had heard about camp was my father would say that, oh, he was able to make the maximum amount per month that was allowed. There were only 2 salary slots. And he was happy that he got his $19 a month working in accounting in the camp hospital. And I'm not sure what my mother did, but anyway, they did not talk about their experiences, probably because it was a traumatic experience, and not talking about it is common to all of the people in their generation.
And that was decades and decades and decades after. That wasn't until I think it was the Bush and Clinton administrations when when those reparations were administered. So that was a very long time. And so, but you had realized that this had happened, this had occurred to your community and to your parents.
Right. And but much of what I know about the history of this imprisonment is me seeking out information. So there is one interview that my brother made of my parents, and he actually videotaped it. And that is about, the only thing. And I always regret not having sat down with my parents and intentionally asked them about their experiences. And even in the video, it's clear that they're very reluctant to talk about it. And their reactions would kind of be derived from Japanese culture, where they kind of laugh it off because they don't really know how to handle the emotions in talking about this experience.
So since your parents answered no to those two questions that sent them from Gila River to Tule Lake, do you view your parents as activists?
Oh, yes. I say that very easily and emphatically because I'm glad that they, in my mind, that is the appropriate answer. Now, I've said that, but I don't want to denigrate or criticize anybody who answered yes. You know, it was an individual choice. And my parents made their choice, and I'm happy they made their choice because I feel like that is the choice that I would have made. Even though there's no allegiance to Japan, I was a US citizen by virtue of being born here. But that is kind of the answer that I would have given as a show of resistance to, you know, this attitude that the government could determine my loyalty to the United States through this questionnaire. So they set that example for me, but there were subtle things, well, not so subtle. At the time, they were subtle because I wasn't thinking, I was too young to think about them, but I know that as I was growing up, my father, I realized, became not a really well-known leader, but he did his part, I think, to contribute to the longevity of some organizations, and some of them were social, like many of the people I think who went to the segregation centers could speak Japanese. And so I know that in the Bay Area, in San Francisco Bay Area, there were these organizations that were based on geographical origins from Japan, social organizations. And I remember they would have these picnics during the summer, and kids my age, we would all play baseball while the adults were doing whatever adults do, drinking beer and barbecuing things. But anyway, I realized that he had an aptitude for accounting. So he used that to help these organizations maintain and sustain themselves financially. And maybe just, I know time is running out, but maybe one more point. At that time, Japanese Americans had great difficulty getting loans. So one thing this organization, these social groups did was, although on the surface it looked like they were meeting on a Saturday to gamble, play poker or play something, actually they were pooling their resources, and they would pool money on a monthly basis, and my father was responsible for how that was invested. And if anybody in the group needed a loan, like to, you know, buy a lease on a business or to buy a house, then the loan that was denied at a bank, the loan could be made by this organization. So that was important, but I didn't know about that. I just thought my father was going to, you know, drink beer and gamble with his friends. But there was an important side of that I only later learned.
And that's a good point that you bring up. In my research, I wrote about a Chinese restaurant on the Circle in the 1920s. And so that was common among the Chinese American community, pulling in those resources, kind of forming a corporation or as a mutual aid society, as you were talking about. And it's common even in the Latino community, Latinx community in Indiana, where they did that in Indiana Harbor in the 1920s and then in the 1930s during the repatriation and Great Depression. So I think that's a good testament to, you know, activism doesn't always look like protesting in the street. Activism is oftentimes subtle, and it's often always an effort to have a better and stronger community, equal identity. So, so we're going to jump ahead. So in 1967, you graduated from UC Berkeley. Shortly thereafter, the Third World Liberation Front strikes happened from 1968 to 1969. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. That was significant, even though the activities were centered on the West Coast. And for me personally, around the Berkeley campus, around San Francisco State in San Francisco, I tried to keep on top of any news and any publications that were coming out on this movement, because it really struck a chord with me. I think as I go off to graduate school in Minnesota, I'm thinking my personal identity development was still in flux and it was still evolving. And so I felt a kinship with those who were part of this budding Asian American movement in San Francisco and in Oakland. And as noted at the bottom of this slide, it says GIDRA. So GIDRA was, as far as I know, the first, or at least the most significant and long-lasting publications that would come out written by Asian Americans. And so I subscribed to that, and I became aware of what was happening, and I had great sympathy for what was happening. And I wish I could have joined them, but I felt like, oh, well, I'm in Minnesota and my job is to be a graduate student. But at some point early in my stay in Minnesota, I decided that graduate school was not for me. And I decided that I really had to pursue what it means to be Japanese American, and more globally, what it means to be Asian American. And just a little comment on that identity of Asian American. Right now, it's kind of become a label, an identity, but back then, I think during this time of great movement and great thinking going on in the community, labeling oneself, identifying as an Asian American was not just an identity that one took on, but it was really a strong political statement. And a political statement in the context of the civil rights movement that was going on in the 60s and the anti-war movement that was prominent in the 60s. So all of that was happening, and all of that contributed to me thinking about who I am and what I am and how I fit in society. So I did eventually quit graduate school. I intended to get a doctorate, but I said, I'll finish with a master's. And I wanted to go to Japan. So I worked in a gas station for 6 months to get the money to go to Japan and enroll in a Japanese language school, because English is my first language. So I wanted to learn Japanese, and I had relatives there. These are relatives on my father's side in a place called Odawara. And when I arrived, it was rice planting time. And I said I wanted to help them plant the rice. And they were pretty emphatic in trying to dissuade me from planting rice. And probably because they knew that as a beginner, I could not plant the rice in these very precise rows. And but anyway, they finally acquiesced and allowed me to participate in the experience, and I do treasure that experience. Nowadays, I don't think people plant rice that way. They have a machine that they could take through the fields and plants the rice. But I thought it was kind of neat for me to get in the mud and connect with kind of my ancestors that way.
So you ended up leaving Japan and going back to California and getting your PhD from
UCLA.
UCLA, because I'm like UCB, UCLA, getting that mixed up. So UCLA, and so you were a faculty person there, and tell us a little bit about the field of study that you went in, because a lot of people know you as an activist, as a very vocal person in terms of equity, race, and culture. So, but what did you study? What were you a faculty member of?
Well, my appointment was in ophthalmology, the Department of Ophthalmology in the UCLA School of Medicine. But I was not a physician. I have a PhD in physiology, and my specialty is neuroscience. So how I ended up in ophthalmology is because my research involved how the brain processes visual and other sensory information to guide behavior. And the behavior that's used as the model in the lab are eye movements. And that's what I did.
Great. So, so in the mid to late 80s, after you were married and started a family, decided to make the great trek back to the Midwest. So Minnesota had been as far as the Midwest as you can get before during your limited time there. You've gone far west, yeah, or east. Sorry, east to the Midwest from California. What were your how did you hear about Indianapolis and the IU School of Medicine, and what were your thoughts of the Midwest and specifically Indiana?
Right. Well, the person who opened up this lab that I directed at UCLA, the person is an MD and an ophthalmologist, and unbeknownst to me, he wanted to become a chair of a department. So he was applying for the chairmanship of the Department of Ophthalmology at the IU School of Medicine. So one day he came to me and said, "David, do you want to move to Indiana?" And I said, "Bleep, no." And I said, "There's no mountains there. Plus it has a history of, KKK." And I thought, I don't want to go there.
Yeah.
And anyway, he did persuade me to come with him for a visit. And it was a nice, crisp spring day, I remember, and everything looked green. And because I made that KKK comment, the people that I met during that short visit were Asian American. In fact, they were both Japanese American, and they were both chairs of prominent departments in the School of Medicine. One, Dr. Watanabe, eventually became a vice president at Lilly. But anyway, I guess my boss, Bob, let the powers that be know that I had made this comment. So they wanted to allay my fears of, racism in Indiana. And these two Japanese American chairs of departments told me that they had had no problems here. And in fact, they had, raised their family in Indiana. And they themselves had interesting backgrounds of how they came here. But anyway, that's another story. And so that stuck in my mind, plus the fact that the person who's asking me to come to Indiana, meaning the person from UCLA who wants to become the chair here, is Chinese American. So I thought, wow, 3 Asian Americans in prominent chairmanships. I thought that speaks well for at least the IU School of Medicine and hopefully Indiana. So I did make the move, and I thought I would only be here 5 years, and now I think it's like 31 or 32 years.
That happens a lot. So before we go to some questions that we have, I wanted you to talk about some organizations that you belong to, specifically the Hoosier chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League, who as an organization has recently decided to donate some of their papers to the Indiana Historical Society. So tell us about the Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL, nationally, and then the Hoosier chapter.
Right. Well, the Japanese American Citizens League, if you go to their site, there's a little line underneath it that says, and it's true that they are the oldest national Asian American civil rights organization. And so they, especially recently, have been involved in being an ally to other civil rights organizations, and unto themselves have always advocated for the Asian American rights and the civil rights of Asian Americans, and have been prominent in countering any kind of anti-Asian racism. And at a local level, there's a young member of the JCL who's a graduate of IU Bloomington, and he found out that IU during the wartime actually banned entry of Nisei students, Nisei being the generation, my parents' generation. They were banned from entering IU. And he obtained, very recently, he obtained an apology from the region. I believe it's the Regents. So it's work like that, I think, that the Japanese American Citizens League shows its potential and its best effect. At the local level, most of the meetings are social. I mean, and that's fine because it gives me a chance to eat Japanese food.
Mm-hmm.
That people make.
I've attended one of your events. It's great. So the Japanese American Citizens League, the Hoosier chapter, has been around since since the 1970s.
I believe so, right. And
Mm-hmm.
I think when I saw the list of participants, I saw some names that I know are the founders of
Yeah. So one of the questions that we had says, why do you think that Asian Americans are rarely discussed as activists? And tell us more about their protest or activism involvement. So yeah, I'll let you answer that as such.
Well, the general answer is because Asian Americans in general, the history of Asian Americans is, as Helen Zia coined the term, missing in history. That if you look at history books, often the contributions of Asian Americans is missing. And so when I teach Asian American history, the Asian American students in my class at IUPUI often will say, wow, we didn't know that. That wasn't, we weren't taught that. And the history of activism in the community is part of that missing in history component. And perhaps when one talks about race, it's unfortunately nationally, but especially in Indiana or in Indianapolis, I've noticed that discussions of race are essentially binary, meaning it's a white-black kind of a discussion, and other people of color and their issues and their histories are often missing from the table. And I'm saying this not to diminish the importance of Black-white discussions. That's a very important part of the dialogue that we should be having in the United States. But in answering your question, I think that Asian Americans are always missing in history. So we're always invisible, and our activism is always invisible because nobody knows about it, nobody hears about it, nobody writes about it, except Asian American scholars maybe.
So I think that's where you could say that the intersection of culture and activism kind of meet. So we have another question. It says, thank you for sharing your experience, Dr. Suzuki. As I know, Japan gradually became an economical superpower again after the war had ended, meaning World War II. Can I ask if you think that gives a positive influence, not governmental influence, but cultural and symbolic, in the civil rights movement of Japanese Americans? Or do you think the movement is a domestic movement pushed by Japanese Americans and other Asian Americans?
On the one hand, what happens in Asia always reflects on Asian Americans. And I think this pandemic and how, quote, the leadership in the White House has used the origins in China in kind of hate. I'll just, I'll put it bluntly because that's the way I talk. I think, President Trump's labeling of the COVID-19 virus as the Chinese virus, that is a very racist comment. And so things happening in Asia always impact Asian Americans, be it a war, and the impact on Japanese Americans, or now being, this pandemic originating in China, even though it's a global pandemic, has led to, they always lead to anti-Asian violence. That said, the movement, in going back to a comment on the movement, the Japanese American and Asian Americans, that movement, the Asian American movement, was a domestic thing. And it comes from this sense of young Asian Americans, when I was young and didn't have all these gray hairs, back in the 60s, having this sense that, although we're third generation Japanese Americans, we've always felt like we've been excluded in the sense of being part of America. And it's common to not just Asian Americans, but common not just to Japanese Americans, but to all Asian Americans. We're born here, we might be here for generations, but we're always asked, where are you from? And the implication of that microaggressive comment is that we're not from here. We're from some Asian country. So the Asian American movement is a domestic movement. And it comes from our sense, Asian American individuals, their sense of their own identity and their grasping to find out more about their own history and their own contributions to the building of the United States.
So speaking on that, so where would you recommend someone to get involved in activism today, locally or nationally? What would you recommend for them? What's that first step that they should take?
Wow. Well, at the local level, it's hard to say. Personally, I would say get involved with maybe a non-Asian American organization if you're interested in civil rights and social justice. So a lot of the work that I currently do is as a member of the NAACP. So work there in partnership with members of the NAACP has led to fostering, or at least pushing for, cultural competency in our educational system, cultural competency of teachers who are predominantly white, and in their interactions with students of color, and also working with the NAACP to promote the passage of an ethnic studies law.
Yeah.
And currently,
so that gets to,
and currently, we're looking at lead poisoning. But that's, I can't go into the details there, but for an Asian American, for young Asian Americans, like say a high school student, I would encourage them to think about going to college. And of course, we're in a pandemic, so that influences everything. But once this clears, find an Asian American group on a student group, because that's where I think young people, young Asian Americans, are going through the same kind of process of figuring out what it means to be Asian American. And many of the young Asian Americans that I see on campus now are second generation, meaning their parents were of the immigrant generation. So they are not aware of this history of the Asian American movement, nor of the civil rights movement, because their parents came into this country after 1965. Until from 1924 to 1965, Asians were banned from immigrating to the United States. And in 1965, immigration was opened up to immigration from Asia. And as an aside, during this whole period, of course, there were no quotas for immigrants coming from Europe.
Oh, there were quotas from certain European countries. The
Maybe
non-quota
Ireland.
was basically, yeah. but it was the Western Hemisphere. So Latinos, Mexicans, and people from Canada we were labeled as, I'm Mexican American, that's why I say we were labeled as non-quota aliens on paperwork. So that's about all the questions that we have for today. I really want to thank you, David, for participating and sharing your life story with us in 2018, allowing us to feature you and among many other people in our Be Heard exhibit in 2019, and soon to be in more educational resources in the next coming years. So, and thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you, David. We are indebted to you.
Maybe if, I don't know, I guess people are leaving the chat room, but if you can leave my email for all those who are still there is dsuzuki, DSUZUKI, at IUPUI.edu. If you do have questions, please just shoot me an email and we can have a conversation via email.
Thank you so much. And that's something we can be sure that we include in the email that's coming out tomorrow. So be looking for that along with all of the links. Again, next week, we'll be back here with more happy hours. So join us as we talk about the Equal Rights Amendment on August 6th, and then keep an eye out for more history happy hours coming soon. We're gonna have another brief history, talking about historic underwear, the stuff of suffrage, and even more. So same time, same place, different Zoom link. So be sure that you sign up at indianahistory.org to get more information about this and our other virtual offerings coming up. So if you missed your chance to donate or would like to give a further gift, you can click that link in the chat right now or at any other time. We'll always accept that. Thank you so much for all of that. Again, you'll be getting an email from us tomorrow morning with all of these links. There will be a survey included. It takes about 1 minute. And we'd love to know what you thought and how we can make programs like this better. So we'll post this conversation at the IHS YouTube channel in the coming weeks. Thank you guys.